Sarah Johnson's day had started like any other Tuesday morning. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon as she got into her simple but well-maintained Honda Civic. Her gym bag sat in the back seat, filled with training equipment for her morning session with elite athletes. The clock on her dashboard read 5:45 a.m., perfect timing to reach the training center by 6:30. As she drove through the quiet streets of Oak Hill, one of the city's most expensive neighborhoods, Sarah noticed how different everything looked at this hour. The large houses with their perfect lawns seemed to be sleeping, their windows dark and still. She had to drive through this area every morning to reach the Olympic training facility, where she worked as a professional athletic trainer. Sarah was deep in thought about her upcoming session. The Olympic trials were just months away, and her athletes needed to be in peak condition. She had spent the entire previous evening reviewing performance data and adjusting training schedules. The responsibility weighed heavily on her shoulders. These athletes trusted her with their dreams. The flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror pulled her from her thoughts. Sarah checked her speed immediately. She had been going exactly at the limit. Confused but calm, she pulled over to the side of the road, making sure to follow all the proper procedures she had learned over the years. Right signal, slow stop, engine off, hands visible on the steering wheel. Officer Mike Patterson approached her car with a flashlight, despite the growing daylight. He was young, maybe in his early 30s, with a stern expression that seemed practiced rather than natural. "License and registration," he said, not bothering with a greeting. Sarah provided the documents without comment, maintaining her professional composure, the same composure she used when dealing with difficult clients or stressful competition situations. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Officer Patterson asked, studying her license with more attention than seemed necessary. "No, sir, I don't," Sarah replied politely. She knew every word and action mattered in these situations. "You ran through the stop sign back at Maple and Oak," he stated, his tone leaving no room for discussion. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She knew exactly which stop sign he meant, and she was absolutely certain she had made a complete stop. She had even noticed the fresh paint on the sign's pole, thinking it was nice that the city maintained things so well in this neighborhood. "Sir, I'm certain I made a complete stop," Sarah said calmly, her voice steady despite her rising frustration. "I'd always stop there because it's a blind corner." Officer Patterson's expression hardened. "Are you saying I'm lying, ma'am?" "No, sir," Sarah replied, choosing her words carefully. "I'm just explaining what I remember doing. I drive this route every morning to reach the training center, and I'm always careful about that intersection." The officer pulled out his ticket book, ignoring her explanation. "This is a residential area with families and children. We take traffic violations very seriously here." Sarah wanted to point out that at 5:45 in the morning, there weren't any children playing in the streets, but she kept that thought to herself. Instead, she said, "I understand, officer. I work with young athletes myself, so I'm always mindful of safety." "Sign here," he interrupted, handing her a ticket through the window. "You can either pay the fine or contest it in court within 30 days. All the information is on the back." Sarah looked at the citation. $500 for running a stop sign. Her hand trembled slightly as she signed. Not from fear, but from controlled anger at the injustice. She had worked too hard and come too far to let this shake her, but it did. As Officer Patterson walked back to his patrol car, Sarah sat still, taking deep breaths like she taught her athletes to do before big competitions. She looked at the time, 6:10 a.m. She would still make it to training on time, and she would still give her athletes the excellent coaching they deserved. But first, she took out her phone and made a note of everything that had just happened, including the time, location, and officer's name. The ticket felt heavy in her hand as she placed it in her purse. Sarah knew she would contest it, not just for the money, but for the principle. She had learned long ago that sometimes you have to stand up for what's right, even when it would be easier to just pay and move on. Starting her car again, Sarah pulled back onto the road, more determined than ever to make this day count. She had no way of knowing that this simple traffic stop was about to lead to something much bigger than a contested ticket. 2 weeks after the traffic stop, Sarah sat on a hard wooden bench in courtroom 302, watching as Judge Richard Henderson processed case after case. The courthouse was an old building with high ceilings and wooden panels that made every sound echo. Sarah had arrived early, dressed in a professional navy blue blazer and matching pants, her hair neatly pulled back. She observed how Judge Henderson handled each case before him. He was a man in his 60s with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, and Sarah noticed a pattern in his behavior. Some people received friendly smiles and understanding nods, while others faced stern lectures and maximum fines. The difference in treatment was subtle but clear to anyone paying attention. As she waited, Sarah reviewed her notes one more time. She had prepared thoroughly for this hearing, just as she prepared for every important event in her life. She had written down exactly what happened that morning, brought a printed copy of her perfect driving record, and even had photos of the stop sign in question that she had taken later that day. Case number 247, Sarah Johnson, contested traffic violation. The court clerk called out, her voice bouncing off the marble walls. Sarah stood up, smoothed her blazer, and walked confidently to the podium. She could feel Judge Henderson's eyes on her as she approached, and she noticed how his expression changed, a slight tightening around his mouth, a small furrow in his brow. It was the same subtle shift she had seen countless times before in her life. "Ms. Johnson," Judge Henderson said, looking down at the papers before him rather than at her. "You're contesting a ticket for running a stop sign in the Oak Hill neighborhood. Do you understand the charge against you?" "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah replied clearly, her voice steady and professional. She had practiced speaking in this room earlier when it was empty, making sure her voice would carry well. "And why exactly are you wasting the court's time with this contest?" Judge Henderson asked, finally looking up at her with an expression that suggested he had already made his decision. Sarah took a deep breath, just as she taught her athletes to do before a big moment. "Your Honor, I respectfully disagree with the officer's assessment. I made a complete stop at that intersection, as I do every morning on my way to work. I have documentation of my driving record, which shows no previous violations in 15 years of driving." Judge Henderson leaned back in his chair, his leather seat creaking slightly. "Ms. Johnson, are you suggesting that Officer Patterson, a decorated member of our police force, made a false report?" The courtroom had grown quieter. Sarah could feel other people waiting for their cases, watching intently. A young clerk at a desk to the left had stopped typing, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. "No, Your Honor," Sarah replied carefully. "I'm simply stating my experience of what happened that morning. I drive that route every day at 5:45 a.m. to reach the Olympic training facility where I work. I'm very familiar with that intersection." "The Olympic training facility?" Judge Henderson's tone was skeptical, as if he didn't believe her. "And what exactly do you do there?" "Clean the equipment." A few muffled gasps came from the gallery. The young clerk's eyes widened at the judge's tone. Sarah stood straighter, her shoulders back, the same posture she taught her athletes when facing challenges. "I'm a professional athletic trainer, Your Honor. I work with Olympic-level athletes preparing for international competition." Judge Henderson waved his hand dismissively. "Ms. Johnson, this court sees many people come through with many stories. The fact remains that Officer Patterson, who has served this community for 8 years, observed you running a stop sign in a residential area. Based on the evidence before me." He paused to shuffle some papers, though Sarah noticed he hadn't actually looked at any of her documentation or asked to see her evidence. "I'm upholding the fine of $500 and adding court costs of $50. Let this be a lesson about respecting traffic laws in our community. Next case." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtroom. Sarah stood still for a moment, her hand gripping her folder of evidence that she hadn't been allowed to present. Behind her, the court clerk was about to call the next case when something unexpected happened. Just as Sarah was turning to leave the podium, a commotion erupted at the clerk's desk. The young clerk who had been watching the proceedings, Jenny Martinez, had accidentally knocked over her water bottle in excitement. As she scrambled to clean up the spill, her phone clattered to the floor, its screen lighting up with a news notification. "Oh my God," Jenny whispered to her colleague, a bit too loudly in the quiet courtroom. "That's her. That's really her." Judge Henderson, irritated by the disruption, looked up sharply. "Ms. Martinez, is there a problem?" Jenny's face flushed red, but her eyes were bright with recognition as she looked at Sarah. "I'm sorry, Your Honor, but I just realized who Ms. Johnson is. She's not just any trainer. She's the Sarah Johnson." Sarah remained standing at the podium, her back straight, her expression calm despite the growing tension in the room. She hadn't wanted to use her professional achievements to influence a simple traffic court case, but it seemed the decision was being taken out of her hands. "What exactly do you mean, the Sarah Johnson?" Judge Henderson asked, his tone somewhere between annoyed and curious. He didn't like having his courtroom disrupted, but something in Jenny's voice made him pause. Jenny quickly picked up her phone and walked to the judge's bench. "Your Honor, Ms. Johnson was just featured in Sports Illustrated last month. She's the head trainer who helped our women's track team win 5 gold medals at the last Olympics. She developed a revolutionary training program that's being studied worldwide." The courtroom had gone completely silent. Even the bailiff was leaning forward slightly, interested in this unexpected turn of events. Sarah could feel all eyes on her, but she maintained her professional composure, the same composure she had taught countless athletes to maintain under pressure. Judge Henderson adjusted his glasses and looked at the phone Jenny was holding out. His face went through a series of expressions: doubt, surprise, and then something that looked like embarrassment. The article on Jenny's phone showed Sarah standing with her team of Olympic athletes, all of them holding their gold medals, with Sarah in the center being presented with an honorary Olympic torch for her contributions to the sport. "Ms. Johnson," Judge Henderson said, his voice notably different now, "why didn't you mention any of this during your testimony?" Sarah took a deep breath before responding. "Your Honor, I didn't think my professional achievements were relevant to whether or not I stopped at a stop sign. I believe everyone should be treated equally under the law, regardless of their job or status." A murmur of approval rippled through the courtroom. Several people in the gallery nodded their heads. Judge Henderson's face had turned a deep shade of red, and he was now looking at Sarah with new eyes, eyes that finally saw the accomplished professional standing before him, not just another face in his courtroom. "I see," he said quietly, shuffling the papers on his desk uncomfortably. The same papers he hadn't bothered to look at minutes ago now seemed to hold his complete attention. The bailiff, a former college athlete himself, was now looking at Sarah with obvious respect. He had read about her training methods in sports magazines and recognized the impact she had made on American athletics. Jenny had returned to her desk but couldn't contain her excitement. She was typing rapidly on her computer, pulling up more articles about Sarah's achievements. The screen showed headlines about how Sarah's innovative training techniques had not only led to Olympic victories, but had also revolutionized athletic training across multiple sports. Judge Henderson cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the still quiet courtroom. The same gavel he had used so decisively moments ago now sat untouched on his desk. He removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, seeming to gather his thoughts. When he looked up again, it was clear to everyone present that something significant was about to happen. Judge Henderson's courtroom had transformed from its usual formal atmosphere into something entirely different. The judge himself seemed to shrink in his high-backed chair as he reviewed more information about Sarah on the court computer that Jenny had quickly pulled up for him. "Miss Johnson," he began, his voice notably softer than before, "I believe I may have been hasty in my earlier judgment." He paused, removing his glasses and placing them carefully on his desk. "Would you mind approaching the bench again?" Sarah walked back to the podium with the same dignity she had shown throughout the entire proceeding. The folder containing her evidence was still clutched in her hands, its contents still unshared. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "I appreciate that you're willing to reconsider, but I want to be clear about something. My achievements in sports training shouldn't affect how my case is handled. I'm here because I believe a mistake was made, and that's what should matter." A few people in the gallery quietly applauded, quickly silenced by the bailiff's stern look. But even the bailiff couldn't hide his admiration for Sarah's principled stance. Judge Henderson's face flushed deeper as he read through the article on his screen. "It says here that you developed a training program that helped athletes reduce their injury rates by 60%, that you've worked with Olympic teams from 3 different countries, that you run free training camps for underprivileged youth." "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah replied simply. "But again, I don't see how that relates to the traffic stop in question." The judge leaned forward, his demeanor completely changed from his earlier dismissiveness. "Ms. Johnson, would you share with the court what happened that morning? And this time, I promise to listen carefully to your evidence." Sarah opened her folder and finally had the chance to present her case properly. She explained her morning routine, showed photos of the stop sign, and presented her spotless driving record. She spoke about her daily drive to the training center and her commitment to safety, both on the road and in her professional life. As she spoke, Jenny continued to update the judge's computer screen with more information. There were pictures of Sarah working with world-class athletes, articles about her groundbreaking training methods, and testimonials from Olympic champions who credited her with their success. Your Honor, Sarah continued, her voice steady and clear, I understand that you have many cases to handle each day, but every person who comes before you deserves to be heard fairly, regardless of their profession or achievements. That's all I asked for when I came here today. The courtroom was silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't the tense silence of earlier, but rather one filled with respect and admiration for the woman standing at the podium. Judge Henderson sat back in his chair, a complex mix of emotions playing across his face. He looked out at the packed courtroom, then back at Sarah, seeming to see everything in a new light. The same room that had witnessed his harsh judgment earlier now waited to see how he would handle this situation. Ms. Johnson, he said finally, you've given me a lot to think about. Not just about your case, but about how we conduct justice in this courtroom. He picked up his gavel but didn't bring it down. Instead, he held it thoughtfully, as if seeing it for the first time. The morning sun had risen higher now, streaming through the tall courthouse windows and filling the room with natural light. It fell across Sarah's face as she stood there, highlighting her composed expression and professional demeanor. The same sun also illuminated Judge Henderson's face, showing every line of concern and contemplation as he prepared to speak again. The entire courtroom leaned forward slightly, waiting to hear what would happen next. Even the people waiting for their own cases to be heard seemed more interested in this moment than their own situations. Something important was about to happen in courtroom 302, something that would go far beyond a simple traffic ticket. Judge Henderson cleared his throat and looked directly at Sarah for what felt like the first time that morning. The computer screen in front of him displayed article after article about her achievements, each one making his earlier behavior seem more inappropriate. Ms. Johnson, he began, his voice carrying a weight it hadn't before, I owe you an apology. Not just for my hasty judgment today, but for something much more serious. He paused, removing his glasses again and placing them carefully on his desk. Sarah remained standing at the podium, her posture perfect, just as she demanded from her athletes during training. The folder of evidence was still open in front of her, its pages now slightly worn from her grip. Your Honor, she said quietly, encouraging him to continue. I've been a judge in this courtroom for 23 years, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. I've always prided myself on being fair and just. But today, thanks to you, I'm seeing something about myself that I'm not proud of. The young clerk, Jenny, had stopped typing completely. Even the bailiff was standing perfectly still, sensing the importance of this moment. The morning sun continued to stream through the high windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. When you first walked into my courtroom, Judge Henderson continued, I made assumptions. I didn't look at your evidence. I didn't really listen to your words. I saw what I expected to see, and I acted on those expectations. That's not justice. Sarah took a deep breath before responding. Your Honor, I appreciate your honesty, but this isn't just about me. Every person who walks into this courtroom deserves the same careful consideration, regardless of who they are or what they've achieved. A murmur of agreement rippled through the gallery. Several people nodded their heads, and one elderly woman in the back wiped tears from her eyes. You're absolutely right, Judge Henderson said, standing up behind his bench. And that's why I want to do more than just apologize. I want to make this right. He turned to Jenny at her desk. Ms. Martinez, please pull up Ms. Johnson's complete file on my screen. Jenny quickly complied, her fingers flying over the keyboard. The judge studied the screen intently, actually reading the documents this time. He looked at the photos Sarah had taken of the stop sign, examined her driving record, and reviewed the original ticket. Ms. Johnson, your evidence is thorough and compelling, he said finally. The photos you took show that the stop sign is partially obscured by overgrown branches, something Officer Patterson failed to mention in his report. Your driving record is impeccable, and your daily routine shows you're familiar with that intersection. Sarah stood quietly, letting the judge continue his thought process. This was the fair hearing she had wanted from the beginning. Moreover, Judge Henderson added, your commitment to safety, both in your professional life and as a driver, is evident. I'm not just saying this because of your impressive achievements with the Olympic team, but because the evidence you brought today clearly shows your character. He picked up his gavel, but this time with a different purpose than before. Based on the evidence presented, and after careful consideration that should have been given from the start, I am dismissing this case entirely. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, but instead of marking an ending, it felt like a beginning. Judge Henderson wasn't finished speaking. However, he continued, looking out at the full courtroom, this situation has brought to light some serious issues that need to be addressed. Ms. Johnson, would you be willing to meet with me and some other court officials later this week? I believe your experience today could help us make some important changes in how we conduct justice in this courthouse. Sarah looked at Judge Henderson thoughtfully before responding to his request. The courtroom remained silent, everyone waiting to hear her answer. This moment felt bigger than just her traffic ticket case. Yes, Your Honor, she said finally, I would be willing to meet. In my work with athletes, I've learned that real change happens when people are willing to have honest conversations about difficult things. Judge Henderson nodded, then turned to address the entire courtroom. I'm going to take a 15-minute recess. When we return, we'll continue with the remaining cases on today's docket, and I promise each one will receive the full attention it deserves. As people began to move and talk quietly among themselves, Jenny rushed over to Sarah with a business card and a scheduling book. Ms. Johnson, could we set up that meeting now? Judge Henderson has some time available tomorrow afternoon. Before Sarah could answer, a voice called out from the gallery, Excuse me, Your Honor. It was the elderly woman who had been crying earlier. She stood up slowly, supporting herself with a cane. I've been coming to this courthouse for years, watching cases. What I saw today, this is important. This needs to be bigger than just a private meeting. Judge Henderson looked at the woman with interest. What are you suggesting, ma'am? Make it public, she said firmly. Let people know what happened here today. Let them see that change is possible, even in places where we least expect it. Sarah watched as other people in the courtroom began nodding in agreement. A young man in a suit stood up next to the elderly woman. I'm a reporter for the City Tribune, he said. With everyone's permission, I'd like to write about what happened here today. Not to shame anyone, but to show how justice can work when we're willing to look past our first impressions. The energy in the courtroom had completely transformed from the tense atmosphere of earlier. People who had come in dreading their court appearances were now actively engaged in a discussion about making their justice system better. Judge Henderson looked at Sarah. Ms. Johnson, would you be comfortable with that? Having this story shared with the public? Sarah thought about her athletes, about how she taught them to turn challenging moments into opportunities for growth. Yes, she said, but I have one condition. What's that? The judge asked. I'd like Officer Patterson to be invited to our meeting, Sarah said, surprising everyone. This isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame. It's about learning and improving together. Judge Henderson smiled for the first time that morning. That's a wise suggestion, Ms. Johnson. I'll have my clerk contact the police department right away. Jenny was already on the phone, her excitement evident as she explained the situation to someone at the police station. The reporter had pulled out his notebook and was writing rapidly, occasionally looking up at Sarah and Judge Henderson with admiration. The elderly woman made her way slowly to Sarah. Thank you, dear, she said softly. You stood up for yourself with such grace. You're teaching all of us something important today. Sarah smiled at the woman, thinking about all the times she pushed her athletes to be not just better competitors, but better people. Sometimes the most important victories happen far from any stadium or track. Judge Henderson cleared his throat again. Ms. Johnson, before we end this session, there's one more thing. I'd like to know more about those youth training camps you run. Perhaps there's a way the court could support that work as part of our community outreach. Sarah's eyes lit up at this suggestion. In her mind, she could already see new possibilities forming, ways to combine her work in sports with this unexpected opportunity to help improve the justice system. The morning sun had risen higher now, filling the courtroom with warm light. What had started as a simple traffic court appearance had transformed into something none of them had expected. A moment of real change. a chance for genuine progress in their community. The next afternoon, the largest conference room in the courthouse was packed with people. Judge Henderson had arranged for the meeting to take place here instead of his chambers, following the community's request for openness. The room buzzed with quiet conversation as people waited for everyone to arrive. Sarah sat at the large oak table, dressed in the same professional manner as the day before. To her left sat Jenny, the court clerk who had recognized her, busy arranging papers and taking notes. Local news reporters lined the back wall, their cameras ready but respectfully quiet. The door opened, and Officer Patterson walked in. He looked uncomfortable in his dress uniform, his usual confidence replaced by uncertainty. Sarah noticed how he hesitated before taking a seat across from her. "Thank you all for coming," Judge Henderson began, standing at the head of the table. "Yesterday, something important happened in my courtroom. Today, we're here to make sure it leads to real change." Sarah watched as more people filed in. Other judges from the courthouse, police officers, community leaders, and even some of her athletes who had heard about what happened. The elderly woman from yesterday was there too, sitting in a comfortable chair that Jenny had specially arranged for her. "Ms. Johnson," Judge Henderson continued, "would you be willing to share your experience again? Not just yesterday's events, but your broader perspective on what happened." Sarah stood, feeling the same calm focus she felt before big competitions. "Thank you, Your Honor. But first, I'd like to say something to Officer Patterson." The room grew completely quiet. Officer Patterson looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time. "Officer," Sarah said gently, "I understand you were doing your job that morning. Just like I do my job every day, training athletes to be their best. Sometimes we all need to step back and look at things from a different angle." Officer Patterson's shoulders relaxed slightly. He hadn't expected this approach. "That's exactly what this is about," Sarah continued, now addressing the whole room. "It's not about one traffic ticket or one court case. It's about how we see each other, how we treat each other, and how we can do better." She pulled out a familiar folder, the same one containing her evidence from court. But this time, she also had something else. She opened her laptop and showed a presentation she had prepared overnight. "In sports training, we use something called performance review," she explained. "We look at what happened, good or bad, and learn from it. I think we can use the same approach here." For the next hour, Sarah led a discussion that transformed the tense meeting into something productive. She shared statistics about traffic stops in different neighborhoods, but also stories of positive interactions between police and community members. Judge Henderson watched in amazement as Sarah skillfully brought different perspectives together, just as she did with her athletic teams. She had turned what could have been a confrontational meeting into a workshop for positive change. "I have a proposal," Sarah said finally. "Let's create a program that brings together law enforcement, court officials, and community members. Not just for meetings, but for real activities. Maybe we start with my youth training camps. Officers and judges could volunteer, get to know the kids and their families." Officer Patterson surprisingly spoke up. "I used to run track in high school," he said quietly. "Never was good enough for the Olympics, but I'd be interested in helping with something like that." The elderly woman smiled from her corner. "And some of us older folks could share our stories, our experiences. Help everyone understand each other better." Judge Henderson stood up again. "Ms. Johnson, you came into my courtroom yesterday expecting simple justice. Instead, you've given us all a master class in community building." Sarah looked around the room, seeing hope and possibility where there had been tension and mistrust. Her phone buzzed. A message from one of her Olympic athletes asking how the meeting was going. She smiled, thinking how different this was from her usual day of training schedules and stopwatches. The sun streamed through the conference room windows, much like it had in the courtroom yesterday. But today, it illuminated something new, the beginning of real change in their community. 6 months later, the community gathered at the Olympic training facility for a special event. The large indoor track was filled with people from all walks of life: athletes, police officers, judges, and community members. Colorful banners hung from the ceiling, announcing the first annual Community Bridge program. Sarah stood at the center of the track, wearing her official Olympic trainer jacket. Next to her was Judge Henderson, looking surprisingly comfortable in casual clothes instead of his usual court robes. Officer Patterson stood on her other side, dressed in a track suit, helping a group of young teenagers warm up for their races. "I can't believe how much has changed," Jenny said, now the official coordinator of the Community Bridge program. She held up a newspaper featuring a photo of Sarah, Judge Henderson, and Officer Patterson working together with youth at the training camp. The headline read, "Traffic Stop Leads to Revolutionary Community Program." The elderly woman from the courtroom, whom everyone now called Grandma Rose, sat in her special seat near the finish line. She had become a regular at these events, sharing stories with young people and offering wisdom to anyone who would listen. "Watch this," Sarah said to Jenny, pointing to the track where Officer Patterson was organizing a relay race. The teams were mixed. Each one had a police officer, a court official, and 2 teenagers from the community. The sight of Judge Henderson passing a baton to a young girl with braids made everyone smile. "Miss Johnson," called out a familiar voice. It was the reporter who had covered the original courtroom story. "Would you mind if I did a follow-up piece? People need to know that real change is possible." Sarah nodded, but pointed to the track. "Let's wait until after the race. I don't want anyone to miss this." The changes went far beyond these community events. Judge Henderson had implemented new training programs for all court officials, focusing on conscious and unconscious bias. Officer Patterson had become an advocate for community policing, speaking at the police academy about the importance of seeing people as individuals. The stop sign at Maple and Oak had been fixed, the branches trimmed back, but more importantly, traffic stop statistics in the area showed significant changes. Officers were taking more time with each interaction, focusing on safety and communication rather than just writing tickets. Sarah's Olympic athletes had gotten involved too. They regularly visited schools and community centers, not just to talk about sports, but to share stories about overcoming challenges and breaking down barriers. Some of them were here today, running alongside community members, showing that excellence comes in many forms. "Sarah," Judge Henderson said, approaching her with a small package. "The Olympic Committee sent this. They want to recognize what you've done here." Inside the package was a special commemoration pin, featuring the Olympic rings and a symbol of justice. The note read, "For bringing the Olympic spirit of unity to community justice." Sarah smiled, but quickly turned everyone's attention back to the track, where the relay race was reaching its exciting finish. The cheers from the crowd weren't just for the runners. They were for something bigger, something their community had built together. Grandma Rose wiped a tear from her eye as she watched. "You know," she said to anyone who would listen, "I've lived here for 78 years. Never thought I'd see something like this." The afternoon sun streamed through the facility's high windows, creating a golden glow over the track. Sarah looked around at everything that had grown from that one morning in traffic court. The friendships formed, the barriers broken, the lives changed. A young girl tugged at Sarah's sleeve. "Coach Johnson, can you teach me how to pass the baton better? I want to be ready for next month's community race." "Of course," Sarah replied, heading toward the track. As she walked, she passed Officer Patterson teaching a group about proper running form, and Judge Henderson timing races with the same stopwatch he now used to ensure he gave proper attention to every case in his courtroom. What had started as a simple traffic ticket had become something nobody expected. A bridge between different parts of their community, a chance for real understanding, and proof that sometimes the most important victories happen far from any Olympic podium.